Hi everyone, my name is Nathan. So for this week, I'm going to be presenting on the topic of the power of normal. I know we spent some time debating the purpose of declaring our positionalities. However, I do think it's important to recognize where we all are going to enter the discussion this week. So I'm going to start off with doing a bit of an introduction. So like I said, my name's Nathan. I'm a white settler. I grew up on the unceded territories of the Algonquin peoples in Ottawa, Ontario. I currently live on the unceded territories of the Saanich, Esquimalt, and Songhees people. I identify as being trans, queer, and masculine. I'm also able-bodied and middle class. Okay, so for my presentation, I'm going to do things a little bit differently than I saw what other people did last week. So instead of running through each reading and doing a giant summary and pulling out themes from each reading, I decided to use Butler's theory of abjection and hailing in order to understand how the normative subject is created and sustained through the construction and maintenance of the subject of the other. So I'm going to do very, very brief summaries of each reading, keeping in mind that everyone has done the readings and has thought about them on their own prior to listening to my presentation. I'm then going to give an example from each reading on how the author discusses the creation of the other in order to in turn create the normative. So I'm going to suggest that without the creation of the other, the normative cannot be sustained or exist. I'm then going to bring this back to social work and give an example of how in practice the creation of the other can have life-threatening consequences for the folks that we will work alongside. And I'm going to finish with asking a few discussion questions relating to practice and again the creation of the other, with hopes that this will lead to an engaging discussion throughout the week. My goal of this presentation is that we are going to be able to discuss and take up how the binaries of the other and the normative are harmful and dangerous to the people we will work with. And hopefully we will have a discussion on how we can resist this in practice. Okay, so I'm going to start off with describing the theory of abjection and hailing. So Butler describes the process of hailing through the use of the example of a police officer yelling, "Hey you," on the street. The turning of the subject towards the law is the point at which identity and subject formation begins. The identity of criminal is based on who turns towards the law and who doesn't. So again, we're already seeing these binaries being created. Who assumes a police officer is hailing them and who assumes they are not being called after. We can assume here that the subject who turns towards the law is one who has had previous contact with the law, someone who fears the law, and one whose body is marked. The unmarked white, cis, hetero body we can assume may not turn towards the law and may assume the police officer is not speaking to them. Abjection is defined as the process by which we work to define ourselves through what we are not. We abject or push the other away from us in an effort to more closely regulate ourselves through the categorization of identity. Through this abjection, the other is created through what the normative is not, creating the binary of us and them. Our relationships with others become pretty important through the process of abjection because without the defining of the other, we cannot clearly define ourselves. So the normative identity is completely relying on this process. So again, I'm going to show throughout this presentation how each of our authors has showed how the normative has been created through the abjection of the other by hailing them into subjecthood. So social work participates in this all the time. The social worker hails the client into the identity as other through the abjection of what the client is and what the client represents. So think here about how child protection social workers make people conform to very strict narratives of what a good parent is, what having a good household is, in order to keep their babies. So for example, Indigenous women need to conform to very strict narratives of parenthood in order to have their babies. So they need to conform to the normative. The profession of social work was born through dominant normative groups from the church and upper middle class white women volunteering to attempt to assimilate different groups of people into mainstream society and correct undesirable behavior, customs, and cultural practices. Social work became, and arguably still is, used as a tool of the maintenance of the hegemony of the norm through the continued enforcement of the culture of white respectability and values onto marginalized community. This practice effectively creates the dichotomy of us and them and hails the client into an identity through the process of abjection by dictating very strict norms of what constitutes an appropriate way to live. So this subject creation happens over and over and over again, not only in social work, but through societal norms and middle class expectation. Thus, this repetitive performance of subject creation happens over and over and over again in society and reminds the subject of their identity as other and hails them into this subjection. So hopefully this made sense. I'm now going to move into the examples of the creation of the other and how this is used to create the normative subjects in each of our readings for the week. Okay, so I'm going to start with Stoller. So Stoller's article gives us a lot to work with here. I'm going to try to zero in on the example of the relationship between the European men and racialized women for our practices, because I think it most clearly shows the example of othering. So Stoller's article addresses the tension of the colonizer and colonized by exploring the role of gender inequality in the example of European role in the African and Asian colonies in the early 20th century. Stoller describes the sexual relationships between white European men and women of color in the colonies. She identifies the ways in which the identity of the colonizer versus the colonized was reinforced through these sexual restrictions, how these gender dynamics shifted to maintain the hegemony. So Europe abjected and othered the racialized women of the colonies by hailing them into different identity categories of the other through regulating sexuality and sexual exchanges between themselves and European men through the concubine relationships they were in. The discourse at one time constructed the sexual relationship between these two groups as a stabilizing force for European men's experience in the colonies, encouraging European men to seek out concubine relationships. However, colonial women were always abjected as morally inferior temptresses that should be treated with suspicion when white women were ready to come over, and consequently the discourse around the concubine then became a threat to the European rule. This also brings up the question of how the normative shifts and molds as it needs to continue to support normative ideas. Women of color were not a threat until they needed to be identified as separate from white women. So now I'm going to ask you to read the quote that's on the PowerPoint. For time purposes, I'm not going to read it. So pause this presentation and read it, and then I'm now going to explain what that quote illustrates. So in this quote, Stoller touches on the necessity of regulating sexual practice and contact between the concubine relationships between European men and racialized women, and how this regulation was used to regulate norms, ideals, and attitudes, and ultimately subject creation. Through this abjection and hailing process, the colonized woman becomes constructed as the racialized other lacking morality and direction, while the European men become morally superior and become the norm, thus reinforcing the need for colonialism. Okay, so for the next reading, we're going to do Sunera. So Sunera's article addresses the ways in which colonialism was justified through the creation of the indigenous people as uncivilized and other, leaving Europeans again as the morally righteous superior. Sunera describes the ways European law has been violently enforced on people of color to maintain the idea of the peaceful nation state, declaring law as moral and the people of color breaking the law as immoral, outside the law and ultimately the other. This article is similar to Stoller in that both articles deal with the justification of colonialism through strict narratives of what is normal and what is other through this hailing into identity categories. Europe effectively secures the European identity as normal by abjecting the indigenous peoples as everything Europe is not. The settler subject in Sunera is only created in direct opposition to the colonial native. On one hand, you have the lawful civilized subject, and on the other, you have the lawless native. So again, I'm going to ask you to read the quote, and then I'm going to explain what that quote means for our purposes. So in this quote, Sunera is describing the ways in which the identity categories and discourses of the native versus settler were secured and maintained through the Europeans abjecting and defining the native as devoid of laws and civility, defining them instead as savages as subhuman, thus justifying European colonization and genocide. So it justified colonialism because the natives were described as savages and subhuman and lawless. Thus, they needed Europeans to bring colonialism in order to elevate them to European level. So this genocide was justified as Europe again positioned itself as everything the native is not. Thus, the normative categories were then secured through the violent infliction of the law. Okay, so next up we have Kaffer. So Kaffer's article deals with the breaking down of different ways of looking and thinking about disability and attempts to identify different ways of imagining a future that views disability more favorably. This article discusses how disability is positioned in society as a terrible, unending tragedy, and any future that holds disability in it is one that should be avoided. Kaffer challenges the idea of disability through the medical and individual model and the social model, stating that the individual model of disability blames individuals and sees disability as primarily a personal problem afflicting an individual person, and thus disability can and should be overcome through strength of character and resolve. The medical model frames disability in terms of conditions to treat in individuals. So again, I'm going to ask you to read the quote that's written on the PowerPoint slide, and I'm going to explain that quote. So Kaffer suggests that the disabled body can again only be understood in relation to the able-bodied person. We see the same kind of construction here as we have in the past two articles. What is the disabled body without the comparison between the able-bodied? What is the European without the native? What is the European without the concubine? So in this case, we see how the disabled body is hailed by the able-bodied in order to abject bodies that function differently or need different services or different types of infrastructure to function. Discourses around what is normative and acceptable and what are not are used to secure these normative ideals. So again, the able-bodied person becomes constructed as the normative through the abjection of the disabled body as othered. These become not issues of social concern under the medical and individual model of disability, but instead becomes problems located within individual bodies that fail to function as the able-bodied, and thus are abjected, and create subject categories that work to create again the binary between us and them, the able-bodied and the disabled, the normative between the not-normal. Okay, and lastly, we're going to look at the SED article. So SED's article, Orientalism, deals with the Western creation of the Orient as other, effectively structuring the East and West divide. Through the introduction of this book, SED describes the ways in which the West created the Orient in order to secure and prepare the ground for which the political and cultural occupation of non-West regions by the West. So SED shows throughout Orientalism how the creation of the Eastern other served as a system, which was implemented through text, images, and actual occupation of the East to demonstrate Western authority and supremacy over the world. So in the introduction that we read, we see SED begins by stating, quote, "The Orient was almost a European invention. The Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as its contracting image, idea, personality, experience," end quote. This again is similar to the other articles we've looked at, as all deal with how the normative is created and sustained through the abjection of the other. In this case, we see the West create more than just the word Orientalism, but creates an entire system or discourse that places the Orient versus, as he says, the Orient. So again, I'm going to ask you to read the quote that's on the PowerPoint. So this quote shows how the West subjecthood is only created through the creation and hailing of the Eastern other. As it says, the Western subjecthood literally becomes everything the East is not. European subjecthood arguably doesn't even need to be said or defined because it is defined through everything the East is not. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to give a quick example that I have of this subject creation from my experience working in psychiatric emergency services this summer at the Royal Jubilee. So I worked with a lot of trans people here who were accessing psychiatric services for a variety of reasons. A theme I saw over and over and over again was how psychiatrists rigidly defined what was acceptable, normative presentations of gender, and what was unacceptable. Psychiatrists routinely commented on the style of dress and gender presentation of our trans patients. This was never done in relation to cis people we served, and absolutely impacted the ways in which trans patients were treated. The moment of entry into Psych Emerge became the moment of the hail. Trans patients were immediately hailed into categories of male or female, and regardless of how they chose to identify. It literally became up to the individual psychiatrist to determine who was able to access our service, so who was undeserving and who was deserving. The trans patients were determined and judged to be properly managing their mental health and thus in need of our services if they were ascribing to the very strict normative, if we think about Pine's article last week, cis-normative notions of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. Again, placing people in these very rigid categories of normative versus other. If trans patients did not perform their gender in cisnormative ways or their gender was ambiguous or illegible, they were abjected as the bad trans subject and hailed into the category of other, and thus were often denied services, kicked out, or the entire interaction became around their lack of ability to conform to cisnormative expectations of gender. The patients were seen as mentally unwell because they were unable to maintain themselves in these normative ways, and instead of being a reflection of how binary categorizations of humans don't work and frankly doesn't exist, it became a reflection of someone's mental wellness status. The abjection must occur specifically under the medical model, where clear ideas of healthy and unhealthy bodies are necessary to maintain faith in medicine and in science. And under this, there are clear ideas about what bodies should and should not look like, similarly to the example of ability versus disability. But here we police how well someone fits into male versus female. Because there is the expectation of two distinct genders and sexes, anything outside of the norm is deemed as an unhealthy body in need of correction. In this case, the correction must occur before one is deemed acceptable enough for further treatment. This is an example of how the creation of abjection and the other has real-world consequences for people. As this example illustrates, trans patients were routinely denied access to life-saving services through the arbitrary categorization of the other and the normative. The creation of the normative through the other leaves people being artificially identified as either or, which in this case means either gaining access to services or not. In this case, social work is the bottom hierarchy in the hospital setting and is charged with carrying out the psychiatrist's plan of action. This often means reinforcing the dichotomy of normative versus other. By acting as an arm of the state, social work actively supports continued abjection in order to maintain hegemony. However, I believe there are opportunities for resistance, especially with a keen awareness of how othering operates and how it impacts the folks we work with. For example, on a micro level, we can challenge the othering of trans people by managing the expectations of colleagues when interacting with gender nonconforming folks and trans patients. Furthermore, by listening to a patient's need when they express that their gender identity is not a mental health concern from them, we can find plans of action that better support the services that they do not. On a larger level, hospital systems could alter their computer systems to reflect names and pronouns patients currently use versus their dead names. This could remove a pattern of othering built into hospital systems. Okay, so throughout this presentation, I have tried to show how the creation of the normative is only possible through the abjection of the other. In all of these examples, the normative subject hails the other into subject formation. One of the main takeaways I hope you got from my presentation is that even though these examples claim to be over, colonialism, ableism, discrimination, transphobia play out in larger systems of power that are embedded into our knowledge. Therefore, this issue is incredibly important to think about as social workers who hold a significant amount of power over people's lives and how people are perceived by other professions, which impacts, like I showed you in my example, people's access to life-saving services, and thus has the power to significantly impact people's lives. So I hope we can now move into discussing some of these questions. So you can go ahead and give those a read, and I look forward to being in conversation with everybody this week. Thanks.